Peiper paused beside a row of trucks, frost clinging to the edges of canvas covers. He ran a gloved hand along the metal, imagining the men inside these vehicles being ferried across miles of road, refueled, redeployed. In his own army, trucks sat idle, half-starved for fuel, soldiers shivering in snow-choked foxholes, engines grinding and failing. The contrast was staggering. German divisions moved like wounded predators, struggling to advance with what little they had, while the Americans had stockpiles that could swallow his offensive whole and still march forward without pause. He let out a breath that fogged the cold morning air, a mixture of frustration, disbelief, and the faintest tinge of fear. "We could never match this," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The words felt heavy, impossible to ignore. His mind raced through possibilities, contingencies, tactical maneuvers, but with every calculation came the same truth. Sheer effort alone would never be enough. Germany had already lost in ways that could not be remedied on the battlefield. Meanwhile, his men struggled under the weight of snow and ice, attempting to siphon fuel into barrels and trucks. Forklifts groaned, engines coughed, and the cold made every task laborious. Soldiers slipped, hands numb, teeth chattering, while the looming forest seemed to watch, patient and indifferent. A few men argued over how to distribute what they could carry, tension rising as frostbitten fingers fumbled with hoses and crates. Each delay, each mistake, carried a sense of mounting dread. Peiper's eyes swept across the depot once more. He could see the enormous scale now, not just in barrels and trucks, but in the planning, the discipline, the efficiency. Every crate stacked neatly, every vehicle parked for immediate use. Nothing was wasted, nothing was left to chance. This was not simply supply, it was a machine, a relentless engine of war that Germany could not hope to rival. He turned inward, his thoughts darkening. We have advanced into enemy territory, taken what we can, yet it changes nothing. Even if we drained this depot dry, they would rebuild faster than we could strike again. Our victories are temporary. Theirs are permanent. This is not a battlefield, it is a warning. The first American patrols had been bypassed. But now the distant rumble of engines on frozen roads reminded him of the fragility of their position. Every attempt to transport fuel became a logistical nightmare. Trucks stuck in snowdrifts, barrels tipping over, hoses freezing. The men's frustration mirrored his own, and he could see the faint cracks in morale forming under the weight of futility. For the first time, Peiper allowed himself a glimpse of despair. Not the despair of a lost skirmish or a failed maneuver, but the despair of inevitability. He had believed in the power of speed, surprise, and ruthlessness. He had believed that Germany could seize advantage, even in the final months of the war. Yet here, in the frozen Ardennes morning, confronted with the sheer abundance of his enemy, he realized that tactical brilliance could never compensate for industrial might. He paused near a cluster of barrels, frost forming on his eyelashes, and looked back at the forest behind them. The lines of trees seemed endless, a labyrinth through which no victory could be guaranteed. He could feel the weight of the war pressing down on him, a cold and invisible hand squeezing the last hope from his chest. His men worked feverishly, unaware of the psychological turning point unfolding in their commander's mind. This cannot be overcome," he muttered, almost inaudibly. "Not by men, not by weapons, not by Germany." His voice was swallowed by the wind, but it carried the truth that had begun to crystallize in his thoughts. The fuel depot was not just a prize. It was a mirror reflecting the limits of his own nation. Snow fell heavier now, soft flakes drifting onto barrels and trucks, muting the clamor of activity. Peiper watched as a few men struggled to roll a half-filled drum onto a sled, their breath coming in ragged clouds. For all their effort, the depot remained vast, infinite in its potential, almost indifferent to human ambition. Each barrel moved felt insignificant against the backdrop of the enormous stockpile. He looked to the east, imagining the Allied supply lines stretching across miles of territory, fueling tanks, planes, and troops with the precision of a clockwork machine. Germany's hunger, its shortages, its endless struggle against time and terrain became painfully clear. The war could not be fought on courage and skill alone. It was a contest of resources, and in that contest, the odds were already insurmountable. Peiper's internal conflict deepened. He had been a soldier, a tactician, a man who believed in decisive action. Yet now, faced with the unimaginable scale of American logistics, he felt powerless. The seeds of despair were planted not in his men, but in him. Victory was no longer a possibility. At best, temporary reprieve could be carved from a war that was already lost. The distant rumble of engines grew louder, echoing off the frozen forest. Reinforcements could arrive at any moment. Every decision, every barrel siphoned, every truck pushed through the snow carried risk. The initial thrill of discovery had faded. Replaced by a chilling awareness, the depot was not a boon, it was a stark illustration of futility. Peiper mounted his horse again, hands gripping the reins tightly. His gaze swept over the depot one final time, lingering on the neat rows of barrels and trucks, on the men struggling to make sense of the bounty before them. He allowed himself a brief acknowledgement of fear, of realization, of helplessness. The psychological turning point had arrived. Even as his troops continued their efforts, Peiper understood the truth he could not ignore. No matter how much fuel they captured, no matter how far they advanced, Germany was already on the defensive. The war was not winnable by valor or cunning alone. The Americans had proven that sheer industrial might and the ability to endure losses without faltering was an unbeatable weapon, and so, amidst the snow, the barrels, and the exhausted men, Peiper felt the first true weight of defeat settle upon him. The depot, meant to inspire hope, had instead delivered an unvarnished lesson. The war was slipping beyond reach. And he, for all his skill and ruthlessness, could not stop it. The clearing was quiet again, but the silence was deceptive. Snow drifted in lazy swirls across the depot, covering the tracks of trucks and men alike. Peiper stood on a slight rise, hands clasped behind his back, surveying the operation below. The sight that had initially sparked awe now gnawed at him with the weight of impossibility. Hundreds of barrels of fuel, neat trucks, and crates stretched farther than the eye could see, but how much could they realistically carry? How much could even his disciplined SS troops move before the Americans returned, before the forest closed around them like a trap? He turned sharply to the sergeant at his side. "We take only what can be transported efficiently. Nothing more. Every minute wasted is a minute closer to disaster." His voice was calm, almost clinical, but beneath it simmered tension. He knew the men were exhausted, the terrain unrelenting, and the enemy not far behind. The soldiers, once buzzing with excitement, were now quieter, brows furrowed, shoulders slumped. Morale was fracturing under the weight of reality. They had glimpsed the scale of American abundance and understood, even if subconsciously, that this bounty was both enormous and ephemeral. One man muttered, almost to himself, "It's too much. How can we even carry it all?" Another spat into the snow. Frustration etched deep into his frozen face. Peiper's mind worked in precise, tactical calculations. Each barrel moved had to be weighed against risk. Each truck sent into the forest was vulnerable to ambush, snowdrifts, mechanical failure. Time was their enemy, the winter roads their prison. He had led offensives before, but this was logistics as warfare, and it threatened to consume them as surely as any enemy gun. The first skirmish came suddenly. A small American patrol, perhaps unaware of the full scale of the depot, approached from the east. Gunfire cracked through the trees, shattering the stillness. Peiper's men dove for cover behind barrels and trucks, exchanging shots, hearts hammering. The firefight was brief, brutal, but it forced them to halt their work. Every pause felt like a betrayal of their mission. Yet moving while under fire would have been suicide. Peiper barked orders, voice slicing through the chaos. "Suppress them. Cover the team's moving fuel. Focus." Men obeyed, adrenaline sharpening their movements, but even as they fought, the reality of their position became clearer. Each skirmish drained energy, each delay eroded the possibility of meaningful success. They could capture the fuel, but only a fraction of it. The rest would remain untouched and untouchable. A silent monument to their limitations, snow continued to fall, softening footsteps, masking the depth of ruts and hidden hazards. Soldiers struggled with barrels that weighed too much, slipping and sliding across ice-covered ground. Some trucks became mired in drifts, engines roaring and choking in vain. The men cursed, their frustration mounting, morale cracking under fatigue and cold. Peiper moved among them, trying to maintain order, trying to impose the illusion of control even as the situation teetered on the edge of chaos. The wind cut through the Ardennes like a sharpened blade, carrying the scent of frost, gunpowder, and fear. Snow crunched beneath the boots of Joachim Peiper's SS troops as they pressed forward into the dead of night, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Around them, skeletal trees groaned under the weight of ice, and distant artillery fire rattled through the valleys. A relentless reminder that this was Germany's final gamble, a desperate bid to turn the tide in the Ardennes. Peiper rode at the head of his column, eyes cold and calculating, a map of the forest etched into his mind. He believed in precision, in discipline, in the power of a sudden strike. To him, victory was a matter of timing, of audacity. Every step forward, every frozen path navigated, carried the promise of glory or ruin. "If we move swiftly, the Allies will never know what hit them," he muttered. More to himself than anyone else, through the darkness, a flicker of light caught his eye. At first it seemed like nothing more than the reflection of ice. But then the shapes emerged, rows upon rows of massive containers, trucks, and barrels stretching as far as the eye could see, fuel, mountains of it. Peiper's pulse quickened, a thrill surging through his chest. He had never expected such a sight in enemy territory. For a fleeting moment, hope flared, a tangible prize to seize. Yet beneath that excitement lay a shadow he couldn't yet name. A creeping sense that this discovery might reveal more than opportunity. The night was silent again, save for the distant roar of guns and the whisper of wind. The frozen forest seemed to watch as if holding its breath, waiting to see whether this advance would mark the dawn of victory or the first hint of inevitable defeat. The forest finally opened into a frozen clearing, and Peiper's convoy emerged from the darkness like shadows stretching into the snow. The night was illuminated by the faint glow of scattered fires and the gleam of steel under the moonlight, revealing an astonishing sight: miles of trucks, barrels and crates arranged in perfect rows, glinting in the icy night. Gasoline, oil, rations, everything an army could possibly need. Peiper's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene. He had expected resistance, sabotage, perhaps a skirmish, but not this. A fortress of supply, standing untouched in the heart of enemy territory, his troops fanned out cautiously, weapons at the ready, eyes scanning for patrols that never came. The silence was eerie, almost sacred, broken only by the distant echo of artillery and the crunch of snow beneath boots. The scale was breathtaking. Tanks of fuel were stacked 3 and 4 high, and trucks bristled with everything from ammunition to spare parts. It was staggering, almost unreal. "Mein Gott," whispered one of Peiper's men, voice tinged with disbelief. It's a city of fuel." Greed flickered in the soldiers' eyes. The men had been operating on dwindling supplies for weeks cold, hungry, exhausted. Some laughed nervously, imagining the possibilities. If they could seize this, even a fraction of it, it would sustain their advance for weeks. Armor could move faster, troops could push further. A tactical advantage like this could turn the offensive around. Peiper allowed himself a small smile. For a moment the war felt salvageable. His mind raced with calculations: fuel distribution, armored divisions, potential routes through the Ardennes. For once, the usual weight of despair seemed to lift. This unimaginable stockpile could breathe life back into the offensive. It could ignite a spark that might, alter the course of the war. But the closer he examined the depots, the more he noticed the precision. Rows of barrels were carefully labeled. Trucks were parked in orderly lines, ready to roll at a moment's notice. Forklifts and cranes were stationed strategically, as if waiting for the next shift of soldiers. Everything was organized, methodical, and efficient beyond anything Peiper had imagined. It was a testament not to luck but to planning, to industrial might. "Look at this," Peiper murmured, gesturing to a row of fuel barrels stacked neatly like soldiers at attention. "They could replace what we take tenfold, 100-fold? Even if we emptied this place tonight, it would not matter. They will rebuild." A creeping unease threaded through him. His soldiers, meanwhile, were already at work, inspecting barrels, prying open crates, filling containers with makeshift hoses. The camp buzzed with activity, excitement crackling in the cold night air. Yet beneath that energy, Peiper felt the first pangs of something he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge. The realization that this victory might be hollow, that this massive logistical prize could be a mirror reflecting the sheer magnitude of the enemy's industrial power. Some of his men joked about it, calling it a gold mine, a chance to live like kings amid the war's misery. Others fell silent, eyes wide as they considered the scale, the impossible resources stacked before them. Even in this moment of triumph, the Ardennes seemed to close in a reminder of the cold, harsh reality beyond the clearing. Snow drifted across the barrels, blanketing the scene in white, muting sounds and giving the impression of a world untouched by war. Serene and yet brimming with latent menace, Peiper moved among them, observing, calculating, planning. Every decision he made now had to account for more than just tactical advantage. The scope of what he was facing was beginning to dawn on him. Each barrel seized, each truck captured, was insignificant compared to the immensity of the American war machine. The depot was more than a target, it was proof, evidence of an industrial capacity that Germany could never match. "Take what we can carry," he ordered, voice firm but measured, "but do not linger. Speed, precision, discipline. This is not a victory parade, it is survival." Even as he spoke, he realized the bitter irony. In a war of attrition, of numbers, of endless fuel and supply lines, this find was almost irrelevant. Germany had overextended, and here was the proof. The Americans had not merely built armies, they had built a nation, capable of sustaining those armies in ways the Wehrmacht could never counter. Peiper's confidence wavered, though he buried it behind steel nerves and tactical commands. His men would not see doubt. He would not allow it. Hours passed in a frenzied haze. Barrels were pried open, trucks siphoned, crates emptied. The cold bit through the gloves of men's hands, frost forming along collars and helmets, but the work continued. And all the while, Peiper walked the perimeter, eyes scanning the tree line, mind racing. He had hoped for a decisive advantage, a turning point in the Ardennes, yet the more he took in, the more the scale of the American effort swallowed his initial triumph. Night deepened, and the forest seemed to exhale around them. Peiper paused on a small rise overlooking the depot. Moonlight glinted off the metal and snow, and for the first time he allowed himself to fully grasp the truth. This was not merely fuel, it was a symbol of inevitability. The Americans could replace what was taken almost as quickly as it disappeared. Their ability to sustain, to rebuild, to overwhelm was staggering. Any temporary gain would be erased within days, hours, perhaps even minutes. He turned back to his troops, who were still working with fervor. In their energy he saw hope, desperation, even greed, but none of the long-term calculation he now realized was required. The depot was a trap of perception, victory in plain sight, yet utterly meaningless against the magnitude of what lay beyond it. And then, somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of artillery grew louder. Not just a skirmish in approaching force. American reinforcements, or perhaps a routine patrol returning. The sound sent a shiver through the men. The night's excitement, the fever of triumph, now transformed into tension. Every barrel, every crate, every moment of delay could become a liability. Peiper's jaw tightened. Finish quickly. Move out. Leave nothing behind that can slow us. His voice was calm, precise. But beneath it lay an awareness he could not suppress. This discovery, monumental as it was a fleeting triumph against a tide that could never be stopped. The clearing, once a beacon of potential victory, now felt like a reminder of the impossible odds. Snow drifted across the stolen fuel, masking the chaos of war beneath a deceptive calm. Peiper knew that no matter how much they captured tonight, the Americans would endure. Their power, their resources, were infinite in ways Germany could not match. The depot, brilliant and overwhelming, was both a prize and a warning, and in that frozen Ardennes clearing, amid barrels and trucks and exhausted soldiers, the first seeds of doubt began to take root in Colonel Joachim Peiper's mind. The war might still rage around him, but the war he had imagined winning swiftly, decisively, gloriously, was already slipping away. The first light of dawn cut through the pines, casting long shadows across the frozen clearing. Peiper rode slowly along the perimeter, eyes scanning the endless rows of fuel barrels and supply trucks. Each container he passed seemed to mock him, a silent testament to a nation's might that he could barely comprehend. He dismounted, boots crunching on snow, and walked among the barrels, lifting lids and checking numbers. 100, 200, 500. Each number felt like a heartbeat of inevitability. The Americans had built more than an army. They had built an entire industrial engine, one capable of replacing any loss Germany might inflict. He stopped by a half-buried fuel drum, frost forming on his gloves as he tried to lift it onto a sled. The effort was immense, and for a fleeting second he allowed himself to feel the full weight of their predicament. This depot, once a symbol of potential victory, was now a reminder of the absurdity of their task. They were not masters of the battlefield, they were laborers struggling against nature, exhaustion, and an enemy that could replace losses faster than they could move supplies. Peiper's thoughts returned to strategy, to cold calculations. If they could only move a limited number of barrels, which units would be prioritized? How much fuel could realistically reach his armored divisions before American forces regained the area? The answers were grim. Even with the depot's abundance, the operation would not save the offensive. Every plan led to compromise, every choice to a limitation they could not overcome. He glanced at his men again, faces streaked with soot and sweat, lips blue from cold. Some had stopped working altogether, leaning on barrels, silent and despairing. The larger picture, the vastness of American supply, the limits of German endurance was sinking into their consciousness. Peiper recognized the signs, murmurs of doubt, hesitant movements, eyes that lingered on the enemy lines in fear rather than confidence. Morale, once bolstered by ambition, was now eroding under the weight of inevitability. Another patrol approached from the north, this one larger. Peiper signaled to his men to hold fire until the last moment. The forest echoed with the crack of rifles, the metallic thud of falling barrels, the rumble of engines struggling through snow. Every skirmish slowed their work, forced them to abandon barrels, retreat with half-filled containers. The depot, vast and untouchable, seemed almost to mock them, a silent reminder that temporary gain could not turn the tide of a war already slipping away. Peiper made a decision. We take only what is practical. Efficiency over greed? The rest stays, he commanded, a hard edge in his voice. His mind raced, tallying what could be carried on sleds, trucks, and by men themselves. Each calculation brought the same disheartening truth. No matter what they salvaged, the Americans' resources would render the capture meaningless in days. Perhaps hours. The men obeyed, but resentment simmered. Some whispered under their breaths, questioning the point of it all. Peiper noticed but ignored it. He could not afford distraction. He rode among them, hands gripping reins tight, scanning the tree line for threats, eyes shadowed by doubt. The tactical dilemma was not just a matter of barrels and trucks, it was a confrontation with futility. Every effort felt simultaneously necessary and pointless. As the day wore on, snow continued to fall, coating the depot in white, muffling sound and masking the true scope of the challenge. Peiper paused at the top of a small rise, looking down at the chaotic ballet below. Men struggled, vehicles stalled, gunfire echoed intermittently. For all their energy and discipline, progress was painfully slow. And in the midst of it, he could not shake the thought that the Americans would simply replenish what they had lost. Faster and in greater quantities than they could ever remove. The wind carried distant artillery fire and the faint hum of vengeance along frozen roads. Reinforcements could arrive at any moment. The depot, once a symbol of opportunity, had become a crucible of tension, frustration, and dwindling morale. Peiper's mind wrestled with every scenario, every contingency. Yet all roads led to the same conclusion. No amount of effort here could change the strategic reality. He rode back through the depot, eyes sharp, voice low but commanding. Move quickly. Leave nothing behind that can slow us. But remember, this is not a victory. It is a task. Complete it and move on. Every moment counts. The men nodded, faces tight with exhaustion, but their energy was fading. Doubt had seeped in, and the first cracks of despair were visible in the cold. Hard lines of their faces, Peiper looked to the horizon where snow and trees merged, imagining the unstoppable tide of American industry behind those few patrolling forces. This tactical dilemma, how much fuel to move, how much to abandon, was more than logistics. It was a revelation of limits, a lesson in the futility of triumph against a nation whose power was almost incomprehensible. The clearing was vast and silent now. Save for the crack of frozen branches and distant gunfire, Peiper's troops labored under the relentless weight of snow, exhaustion, and awareness. He knew the depot's capture would not save the Ardennes offensive. It was a temporary gain, fleeting and inconsequential against the enormity of Allied resources. And as he surveyed the chaotic, frozen scene, Peiper understood that the war was slipping through his fingers. Victory, once imaginable, was now a distant illusion. The depot, magnificent and untouchable, was both prize and warning. In the cold and the snow, among exhausted men and stalled vehicles, he felt the first deep certainty their triumph here was meaningless. And the end of Germany's hope was already in motion. The first echoes of engines came from the east, faint at first, then growing louder, reverberating through the frozen forest. Peiper's sharp eyes caught movement along the snow-choked roads. American reinforcements were arriving faster than anyone had anticipated. Panic flickered through his men as the distant hum of motorized vehicles became a low roar. The depot, once a symbol of potential triumph, now felt like a trap. Pull back. Now. Peiper's voice rang out, crisp and commanding, cutting through the chaos. Soldiers scrambled, abandoning half-filled barrels, slipping on ice and snow, their breaths ragged, lungs burning from exertion and fear. Trucks spun wheels helplessly in drifts, engines roaring and dying, leaving men stranded with crates and barrels that could never be carried. Fast enough. Every step backward felt like a defeat magnified. The immense fuel stockpile, gleaming under the cold morning sun, was useless. It could not accelerate their withdrawal, it could not shield them from reinforcements, it could not turn the tide of the Ardennes. Men cursed and shouted, dragging sleds over frozen ruts, while others tried to restart engines that refused to cooperate. The snow mocked them, heavy and unyielding, obscuring paths and swallowing progress. Peiper rode through the chaos, eyes scanning for threats, mind calculating every possible outcome. The initial thrill of discovery had evaporated, replaced with an unvarnished truth. This operation, no matter how successful in theory, could not compensate for Germany's dwindling resources. Vehicles were abandoned, barrels left behind, men exhausted to the point of collapse. It was not a retreat, it was survival. He glanced back at the depot, rows upon rows of untouched fuel gleaming in the sunlight. So much potential, so much power, now meaningless. The realization struck him with crushing clarity. Germany's war machine was faltering. They could seize tactical prizes, win small battles, yet the larger war was already slipping from their grasp. Victory was no longer achievable. Even a temporary gain here could not reverse the strategic collapse. The forest itself seemed alive, pressing in with the sound of distant artillery and the whistle of winter wind. Snow fell thicker now, covering tire tracks and footprints, erasing evidence of their temporary hold. Each second wasted became a threat. Every stalled vehicle was a liability. Peiper's men moved with urgency, fear mingled with frustration. Yet no amount of speed could overcome the immutable scale of Allied logistics. In a brief moment of quiet, Peiper allowed himself to feel it fully, the enormity of what they were facing. Germany could not match this. No discipline, no courage, no tactical brilliance could overcome the Americans' industrial might. The Ardennes offensive, once a symbol of hope for the Reich, was crumbling in the snow. Against an enemy who could replace losses almost instantly, move forces effortlessly, and sustain their army indefinitely, the last of the barrels were abandoned as Peiper signaled the final retreat. Soldiers slipped through the forest, engines coughed, and crates tumbled into snowdrifts. The depot, a monument of untapped power, receded behind them, a silent witness to futility. For all the planning, for all the discipline, for all the courage, the capture had changed nothing. Peiper rode at the rear of his column, silent, eyes fixed on the path ahead. The weight of the operation pressed upon him like snow on the branches above, a reminder that the war was not just fought in battles, but in resources, in endurance, in scale. And here, confronted with the tangible evidence of American abundance, he understood with absolute clarity. Germany's defeat was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. The snow swallowed the sounds of retreat, leaving only the echo of boots, engines, and artillery in the distance. Behind them, the depot stood gleaming, indifferent, a reminder of what could not be changed. Peiper's jaw tightened. The Ardennes would be remembered not as a victory, but as the moment Germany glimpsed the limits of its power and found them insurmountable. The forest was silent now, save for the distant rumble of artillery fading into the horizon. Peiper's column moved sluggishly through the snow, each step of boots and wheels echoing in the empty woods. The retreat from the fuel depot had left its mark, exhausted men dragging themselves along, frostbitten hands gripping sleds and engines coughing in protest. The initial thrill of discovery had vanished, replaced by the heavy weight of reality. Peiper rode slightly ahead, surveying the aftermath, and could not suppress the bitter reflection that gnawed at him. He thought of the soldiers he had led through this offensive, their faces pale with cold, eyes hollow with fatigue, bodies pushed to the brink. They had marched for days through the Ardennes, fighting both nature and the enemy, only to confront the stark truth of what they could not overcome. This was not heroism. It was survival against impossible odds. Even the brief victory of seizing the American fuel depot now seemed almost cruelly ironic. They had touched abundance, tasted potential, and yet it had changed nothing. The captured fuel lay behind them, abandoned in snow and silence. Each barrel, gleaming beneath the winter sun before their retreat, had become a metaphor for Germany's overreach. Peiper understood now that their ambition had outpaced reality. They had believed in skill, speed, and daring, but these were meaningless against a nation capable of producing, replenishing, and sustaining an army on a scale beyond comprehension. The depot, magnificent in its organization, represented not opportunity, but a mirror reflecting Germany's strategic miscalculation. Peiper's mind wandered further, tracing the trajectory of the Ardennes offensive and the human cost it had exacted. Men had frozen in foxholes, struggled through drifts, endured hunger and exhaustion, all in service of an operation that could not succeed. He felt the moral weight of decisions made under pressure, the lives risked, the orders given, the small gains achieved only to vanish into futility. Every choice had carried consequence. Yet even the most meticulous planning could not overcome the arithmetic of American resources. Despite the despair, Peiper could not help but acknowledge a grudging respect for the enemy. The Americans had orchestrated this depot with precision, discipline, and foresight. Each barrel stacked, each truck aligned, each crate labeled and positioned spoke to a level of industrial and logistical mastery that was awe-inspiring. It was a stark contrast to the chaos of the German effort, where shortages, frozen roads, and relentless winter turned every minor operation into a struggle for survival. He admitted to himself quietly that this was a lesson in scale and efficiency, one that Germany could not hope to counter. The men trudged past, some silent, some muttering complaints, others staring ahead as if through the forest itself. The snow, now thick and unyielding, muffled sound and absorbed energy, leaving only the weight of exertion pressing down on them. Peiper observed them with a mixture of sorrow and detachment. They had given their strength and obedience without question, Yet the world around them had rendered their efforts meaningless. There was no anger in him now, only recognition of the bitter reality. He thought back to the moment of discovery, when the depot first came into view, and how hope had surged through him and his men. How quickly that hope had been replaced with despair. How the fleeting thrill of triumph had dissolved under the cold arithmetic of logistics and reinforcements. The memory of gleaming barrels, of trucks ready to roll, haunted him. It was a stark reminder of human ambition constrained by forces far greater than courage or skill could influence. The retreat continued, snow crunching under wheels and boots, the forest closing around them. Peiper's reflections were interrupted by small incidents: slipping men, stalled engines, the occasional shout as a crate tipped or a sled overturned. But these were minor compared to the overarching realization that had settled upon him. The war was not winnable through audacity alone. It required resources, endurance, and a scale Germany could not match. Every barrel left behind, every engine that failed, every frozen path was a symbol of that immutable truth. In the quiet moments, Peiper allowed himself to confront the emotional weight of failure. The Ardennes had promised opportunity but delivered a lesson in inevitability. His men, brave and disciplined, had become instruments in a game where the rules were dictated by industrial might rather than valor. The depot, once a shining hope, had become a monument to overreach and miscalculation. Germany had underestimated the enemy, overestimated itself, and now paid the price in fatigue, frustration, and a creeping sense of doom. As the sun began to dip behind the pines, casting long shadows over the snow, Peiper's mind lingered on the depot one final time. The barrels, trucks, and crates glimmered faintly in the fading light, untouched and resilient. The Americans' capacity to replace losses, to sustain their war machine indefinitely, loomed in his thoughts like a cold, inescapable shadow. The retreat was not just tactical, it was symbolic. A recognition that the larger battle had already been lost. Silence fell over the column, save for the crunch of snow and the occasional groan of tired engines. Peiper's face was etched with weariness and resignation. He had survived the Ardennes, guided men through chaos, faced skirmishes and frostbite alike, yet the war itself seemed beyond his grasp. He rode in quiet contemplation, the captured fuel behind him a haunting reminder of both what had been attempted and what could never be achieved. And in that bitter, frozen reflection, Peiper understood fully. The war was slipping from Germany's hands, not because of individual failures or battlefield mistakes, but because the sheer scale of the enemy's industrial and logistical power rendered every triumph transient. The depot, once a beacon of potential, had become a mirror of inevitability, and the weight of that truth pressed upon him, cold and relentless. As the Ardennes receded into memory, the snow lay thick over the Ardennes, a silent, indifferent witness to the events of the past days. Peiper rode slowly along the edge of the forest, eyes scanning the remnants of the depot and the exhausted columns of his men. The captured barrels gleamed faintly under the pale winter sun, rows of trucks abandoned, engines cold, as if the depot itself were holding its breath. It was a landscape of both human effort and futility, a stark reminder of the limits of courage and the inexorable weight of resources. Every step through the snow reminded him of the human cost. Men trudged forward, faces pale and drawn, boots frozen, bodies aching from overexertion. Their efforts, once infused with hope and ambition, had been reduced to survival. The retreat had stripped the Ardennes of triumph, leaving only fatigue and the bitter taste of lessons learned too late. Peiper understood now that no amount of discipline, tactical brilliance, or daring could compensate for the industrial might arrayed against them. He paused on a small rise overlooking the depot. The sight was haunting. Trucks sat like frozen skeletons of a battle never fought, barrels of fuel untouched and abundant, neatly aligned as though mocking the labor of the German soldiers. The scale was staggering, endless, infinite, a testament to a nation capable of sustaining a war far beyond the grasp of Germany's desperate offensive. The depot had promised victory, but instead it revealed the truth. The enemy's strength was in numbers, resources, and logistics, not in the bravery of individual soldiers. Peiper's mind reflected on the operation as a whole, the hours of labor. The skirmishes with small patrols, the frozen roads, the stalled trucks. All of it had been a temporary distraction, a fleeting moment of agency against an unstoppable tide. The Ardennes had offered a glimpse of what could be seized, but it could not alter reality. Each barrel left behind, each truck abandoned, was proof that the war could not be won by audacity or skill alone. It was a war of scale, endurance, and inexhaustible resources, and Germany was already outmatched. He thought of his men, loyal, disciplined, and exhausted. They had followed orders through chaos, frost, and enemy fire. Yet even their courage could not rewrite the arithmetic of war. The depot, now receding behind the retreating column, symbolized the futility of their labor. Every attempt to seize it had been temporary, fleeting, irrelevant in the larger scope of the conflict. Peiper felt a deep, almost physical ache, a combination of frustration, resignation, and dawning comprehension. The forest around them was silent. Snow muffling footsteps, absorbing the echoes of human effort. The abandoned vehicles, frozen barrels, and footprints in the ice created a surreal tableau, a frozen monument to ambition and overreach. Peiper realized with chilling clarity that Germany's fate had been sealed long before this moment. Tactical victories were possible, yes, but they could never overcome the inexhaustible machinery of the American war effort. He rode past the last line of men, glancing at exhausted faces, frost-lined helmets, and eyes haunted by fatigue and doubt. For the first time, Peiper admitted it aloud. Though no one needed to hear, we could never win against a country that could afford to waste so much. The words lingered in the cold air, heavy and unyielding, a summation of defeat that no battlefield maneuver could erase. The depot receded into the distance, snow drifting across trucks and barrels, erasing tracks, covering the traces of fleeting triumph. The soldiers pressed on, moving through the forest like shadows, silent, weary, and aware of the magnitude of what they had faced. The Ardennes had shown them that bravery and strategy were insufficient in the face of industrial and logistical supremacy. The lesson was harsh, unrelenting, and unforgettable. Peiper's gaze returned to the snow-covered clearing one last time. The depot gleamed under the pale winter sun, untouched and untouchable, a reminder of what humanity's ambition could not overcome. His mind lingered on the barrels, the trucks, the exhausted men, and the immutable fact that Germany had been outmatched in ways that no battlefield triumph could ever overcome. And so, the Ardennes fell behind them, a frozen monument to futility. Peiper rode on, silence pressing in, the snow-covered depots and abandoned tanks, standing as grim witnesses to the truth he could not escape. The war was already lost.